Welcome to Adventures in Snacking, and today I'm going to show you how to turn these beautiful fresh ingredients into a bright and vibrant hot sauce using some simple techniques and a little bit of kitchen magic. No, not that kind of magic. No, not that kind of magic either. Ah, yeah, that's what I'm talking about. Fermentation magic. I might even throw in some extra magic ingredients along the way. So let's get stuck into some kitchen sauce-ery. See what I did there? And I'll show you how it's done. If that sounds interesting to you, then consider clicking the like button and subscribing for more. Let's get adventurous. So let's start with our fresh ingredients. I've got a lovely fresh bunch of coriander, one whole head of garlic peeled, a whole stack of green chilies. This is about 300 grams of mixed Serrano and Fresno chilies. Jalapenos would also be great in this, or any other medium heat green chili. And I've also got a couple of green tomatoes. I've got tomatoes growing in my backyard right now, so I've got plenty of green tomatoes to spare. If you don't have access to green tomatoes, you can either leave them out, the sauce will be just fine without them, or you can substitute with red tomatoes, although doing so will make your final sauce a little bit less green. To start with, I've got a nice clean mason jar, to which I'm adding the peeled garlic cloves. No need to worry about slicing them, it's all gonna get blended later. Starting with the coriander, I like to chop the stems into smaller pieces. The stems have really good flavour, but the long fibres of the stems can make it a little bit hard to blend. But if you've got a really high-powered blender, this might not be an issue and you can skip this step. And then we're adding that coriander to the jar along with the garlic. Next up, I've got 2 green tomatoes. Again, there's no need to be too fussy about slicing these nicely. It's all going to get blended together in the end, so I'm just cutting these into quarters. Then they're going into the jar with the other ingredients. Then we're slicing the green chilies. And then we stuff all those chilies into the jar. And I have to admit, this has turned out to be a little bit more snug than I was expecting it to be, but with a little bit of brute force, I think we'll get them all in. Next, we'll fill the jar right up to the top with some filtered water. To calculate the salt percentage for our fermentation, I'm going to take the total weight of this full jar, which is about 1300 grams, and from that I'm going to subtract the weight of the jar, and that should give me the total weight of the contents. My jar weighs 430 grams, so the total weight of the contents is 872 grams. I want the percentage of salt in this fermentation to be 2.5% of the total contents of the jar. So I'm taking that 872 and multiplying it by 0.025 to give me 2.5% of that by weight, 21.8 grams of salt. So we'll need to use a sensitive set of scales to weigh out a quantity of sea salt as close as we can to that amount. That's close enough. I'm tipping the water back out of the jar into a jug so that I can mix the salt in. This is also a good chance to get rid of some of those floating chili seeds because we want everything in the fermentation to be submerged below the brine, ideally with no floaties on top. Otherwise, our nice clean fermentation could turn into a moldy mess, and nobody wants that. Once all the salt's dissolved, I'm pouring the water back into the jar through a strainer to catch out those seeds. And a few more have floated to the surface, so we'll just take care of them as we go. I've then got a clean glass weight that I'm going to use to make sure that everything stays submerged below the brine. And this is a very tight fit, but again, a little brute force and I think we'll get there. So I'm squeezing that into the jar and securing it in place with the lid. This has caused a little bit of brine to overflow, but that's fine, it just means the brine level in our jar is now full to the brim, which is perfect. If you want to spend the money, you can muck around with fancy fermentation lids, but for this, I'm keeping it simple. I'm just going to use a regular lid, and to make sure the fermentation pressure doesn't get too high and make the jar explode, I'll just loosen the lid slightly once a day to let the pressure out. So this is that ferment on day 1 of fermentation. Just a lot of beautiful fresh ingredients jam-packed into a jar full of brine. And this is that same fermentation on day 3, and as you can see it's actively fermenting, there's lots of bubbles being created, and I'm just loosening that lid to release some of the pressure before tightening it back up again. And this is that same fermentation on day 7. It looks like a nice clean fermentation, there's nothing nasty growing. It smells fresh and vibrant with a little bit of funk, and this is going to make an absolutely delicious hot sauce. I'm straining the ingredients out, but I am going to keep all of the brine because we will be needing to use some, if not all of it, in the final recipe. Pop all of those into a blender if you have one, but today I'm using a stick blender, so I'm just putting these in a slightly larger jar to give me a little bit more room to work with. And for a little bit of extra fruity acidity, I'm adding the juice of a lime. Whoops, it's squirting all over the place, but I'm pretty sure some of that went in the jar. Then blend that up, adding more brine back in as required to get it as smooth as you can. And I ended up needing to add all of the brine back in order to get a nice fine saucy consistency. And this is about as fine as I could get it. As you can see, it's still pretty chunky. You could keep it as a chunky sauce like this and keep all the beneficial bacteria that's in it, but I fermented this for flavour, so I'm not too worried about keeping that bacteria alive. I'm going to cook the sauce out to further blend and mellow the flavours and soften up the remaining chunks so I can puree it into a nice, smooth, pourable hot sauce. Bring this up to a boil. It doesn't need to cook for very long. You'll find that after a few minutes the chunky bits of vegetables break down a bit further and everything gets a little bit more watery. And that means that all those little chunks are pretty much cooked through. And next it's time for our final magic ingredient, spinach. It might seem a bit unconventional, but it blends all of the flavours together with a nice earthy background note, and if you add this just as the sauce is coming off the heat, it should retain a nice vibrant green colour, which will then transfer into the final sauce. Just mix it through the sauce and there should be enough residual heat to cook it all the way through. And then give the sauce one last really good blend. I like to add a tiny bit of xanthan gum to most of my hot sauces. It's totally optional, but it just makes them a little bit thicker and glossier and tends to stabilise them and stop them from separating in the bottle. But you do only want to use a tiny amount and you want to make sure it's really well mixed in. So for this quantity of sauce, I'm only using 1/8 of a teaspoon and I'm adding that very slowly as I blend it. And that's looking pretty good. I'm going to give it one last taste to make sure the seasoning's right. It seems pretty good, so now I'll put it through the final step. To make the sauce extra smooth and flowy, I'm going to pass it through a sieve. So working in small batches, just put some in a fine mesh sieve and work it around with a spoon or a ladle until the liquid's gone through and the solids remain. If you don't want to waste the solids, there are good uses for them. If you dry this out in a dehydrator or a low oven, you can turn it into a really good spice rub. So after that, we're left with about 700 ml of sauce, and as you can see, it's a much nicer, smooth and saucy consistency. One final taste test just to make sure I'm still happy with the flavour balance, and yep, that is pretty darn good. Finally, use a funnel to pour that into some sterilised glass bottles. If you test the pH of this, it should be well below a pH of 4, which means it should technically be shelf stable, but I tend to keep it in the fridge anyway. And this green magic sauce is punchy, vibrant, fresh and spicy, and goes beautifully on fish, chicken, tacos, or just about anything. So why not give this recipe a try? And until next time, happy snacking.